Could I first express my thanks to the Turkish Green Crescent Society and to the World Health Organization for inviting me to this meeting. I'm very pleased and honoured to be here, grateful for the opportunity to share some of my ideas with you. I want to talk about drug prevention programs and their effectiveness, and in particular talk about some ideas about how we might conceptualize prevention, think about different approaches to prevention, think about what our conceptualization of prevention might mean for understanding the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of different approaches to prevention. And before I go on to start my talk, I'd like to say that I'm quite heavily involved in the organisation of scientific networks for prevention and a research society for prevention across Europe. We're in the early stages of the development of these initiatives, and we'd be very pleased to talk about the possibility of collaboration and co-working with colleagues from Turkey in the future, if that's a possibility. So if any of you are interested in getting involved in collaboration or cooperation with colleagues across Europe, then please take some time at the end to come and see me, and we can have a quick chat about that. Okay. So the first slide here offers up a definition of prevention. I don't propose to have a long discussion or debate or consideration of how we define prevention as part of this talk, but I'm just offering this up as a framework, a definition of prevention that I use that helps me think about conceptualizing prevention. And the definition here for prevention science, prevention research, is a systematic study of interventions, preventive interventions, to reduce the incidence of maladaptive behaviours and to promote adaptive behaviours in populations. So firstly, it's broader than simply drug abuse, but it does encompass drug abuse. At the same time as having a working definition for prevention, we also need to, I think, consider how we conceptualize different approaches to prevention. And this was recognized as early as 1994 by the US Institutes of Medicine in a report in which they stated that without a system for classifying specific interventions, there is no way to obtain accurate information on the type or extent of current activities, and no way to ensure that prevention researchers, practitioners, policymakers are speaking the same language. And I go along with that. I think it's really important that we think hard about how we conceptualize prevention, how we frame preventive interventions in order to speak the same language. Robert Gordon was an assistant director to the US National Institutes of Health in the 1980s. And in 1983, he offered up this conceptualization for prevention. It's a conceptualization that Dr. Burkhardt has already mentioned. He suggested that we should consider different forms of prevention, and he offered this up to move us away from what he regarded as fairly outdated notions of primary and secondary prevention, which were grounded in ideas of infectious disease rather than chronic conditions which had more diffuse etiologies and epidemiological vectors. So he suggested that universal programs were interventions which are delivered across a whole population, a community or a setting, regardless of the level of risk for individuals receiving the intervention. There's no sense of targeting individuals because they are at higher risk within a universal prevention programme. Contrast that with two forms of more targeted interventions. Selective intervention, preventive interventions, are aimed at groups that are identified as being at increased risk because of their health history or psychological and social characteristics. And indicated prevention is focused more on individuals, only those individuals rather than groups who are personally identified to be at high risk for a problem or disease. This conceptualization that was proposed by Robert Gordon in 1983 was in fact adopted by the US Institutes of Medicine in 1994 and revisited in 2009 by a new Institutes of Medicine committee and endorsed. So the Institutes of Medicine in the US regard this as a useful working conceptualization of prevention approaches. But to my mind, it's a good approach, but it isn't quite sufficient. It doesn't really give us an indication of how different prevention approaches are undertaken and what sort of functions different prevention approaches might serve. And if we think about the functions of prevention, I suggest that there are three broadly conceived categories of the functions of prevention that we might consider. Firstly, environmental prevention. Interventions which limit the availability of maladaptive behaviour opportunities through system-wide policies and restrictions. For example, legislation, price controls. Environmental interventions are mostly concerned with supply control activities. That contrasts with the other two categories on this slide, which are oriented more towards demand reduction activities. Firstly, developmental approaches to prevention. Developmental approaches, I suggest, are those interventions which are aimed at promoting adaptive behaviours and preventing maladaptive behaviours through the early socialisation of appropriate norms, values and habits, which follows on, I think, quite neatly from the presentation that Dr. Burkhardt gave. The early socialisation is pretty important in terms of the developmental trajectory for the development of substance misuse, and I'll go on to give some examples of that in a moment. The third category is informational prevention. These are those interventions which address existing cognitions about specific behaviours through persuasion. They try to change the attitudes, the values, the norms that people have about particular behaviours through providing information, through raising awareness, and through challenging preconceptions. So if we accept these three categories in terms of the functions of prevention, the question then is, what does it look like when we put these together with the forms, if the slide will work? There we go. Okay, this is, let's skip this slide. Okay, so if we put form and function together, we come up with this prevention matrix where we have environmental prevention across the top row, developmental prevention and then informational prevention, universal prevention in the first column, selective prevention, and then indicated prevention, that progressive targeting of prevention that I mentioned in terms of the approach that Robert Gordon suggested. And we can look at these different approaches to prevention in terms of specific actions or examples. So, for example, an environmental and universal approach might be legislation to prohibit substance use, suppression of international supply routes. Contrast that with a universal and informational approach, which might be those mass media programs to raise awareness of the risks of drug use, to encourage individuals to behave responsibly. I think somebody mentioned earlier a particular campaign which suggested that people should love themselves and not do drugs. That might fall into this category. Through to, for example, selective developmental programs, which might be family or parenting programs with families in the most deprived areas in a region or country, or home visiting programs with vulnerable pregnant women. I don't propose to read out every cell in this matrix. I just hope that you get the idea of the proposed structure for classifying prevention into a form and function matrix here. What I will do, though, is move on to talk about some specific examples. And let's start with an example of selective environmental prevention. This is a photograph of a place in New York called Bryant Park in the 1980s. There's a derelict, drug-dealing public area, regarded as a no-go area, not a very pleasant public space. And then somebody came along and said, well, let's do something about this public space. Let's invest some money, and they managed to get some funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and try to change this public space. Let's move the drug dealers out. So over a period of time, with sufficient funding, energy, enthusiasm, they were able to renew this public space. And this is what it looks like today. It's a safe, family-oriented public space. No drug dealers anymore. So this is an example of a universal prevention program by enforcement, by moving drug dealers on, by reducing the availability of substances in a specific location. Because it's targeted in a specific area, then it fits in that sort of selective stroke universal category. Is it an effective approach? Well, the answer is we don't really know, because this wasn't a scientific study. Yes, we've got pretty good evidence that this space is being used now for more functional things, for better things. We've got families here doing some exercises. But it's possible that the drug dealers just moved elsewhere. They were displaced. So we don't know if there's been a reduction in drug use and drug harms associated with this sort of environmental intervention. And the general point here is that these interventions, these environmental interventions, I think are very promising, but we don't do enough research in this area. We need to do more and better research to look at the effects of these sorts of selective and even universal approaches to environmental prevention to see if they are in fact effective in terms of drug abuse. Professor Baber mentioned earlier on the Drug Policy and the Public Good book, and there were some specific conclusions drawn about supply-side interventions. The supply side I mentioned earlier, I think, fits quite neatly within this conceptualization of environmental prevention. I'm not a particular expert in this area myself, and a number of the other authors of the book have much more expertise, but the general conclusion, and this I think reinforces the point that Professor Baber made earlier, drawn in the book about supply-side type of interventions, are, for example, that efforts by wealthy countries to curtail cultivation of drug-producing plants in poor countries have not reduced aggregate drug supply or use in downstream markets, and probably never will. And that once a drug is made illegal, there is a point beyond which increases in enforcement and incarceration yield little added benefit. But that's with the caveat that there actually isn't all that much really good, useful research in terms of environmental prevention. So my plea is, I think it's a rich area to mine, and we should do some really good research in that area. Let's move on to illustrate a particular aspect of developmental prevention, and I'm going to focus on a universal program. It's a classroom behaviour management program to pro-socialise children. Why do we need to pro-socialise children, you may ask? Well, if it's interesting. If you look at research on the developmental epidemiology of antisocial behaviour through to consequent behaviours in adolescence, we get this sort of a picture. At the age of 5 years or so, then antisocial tendencies, disruptive behaviours are becoming apparent in around about 15% of children. And these are at the more marked end. Mild disruptive behaviour is apparent, according to surveys in the UK, in around 30% of additional 30% of children. So we've got oppositional and defiant tendencies, some early signs of breakdown in parent-child relationships and also in sibling relationships. A proportion, a high proportion of those young people will go on to become involved in violence and fighting, have difficulty with peers, problems in terms of bullying, reduced self-esteem at the age of 8 years, and on to 11 years, poor school achievement, so we get poor educational outcomes, start to get involved with deviant peer groups by the early teenage years, problems with the police, and then a significant proportion would become career offenders, unemployed, drug misusers of the future. There is an escape route for a proportion, a small proportion, who don't go on, and there is also an incoming group who don't have any previous history of antisocial behaviour who start to get involved as well. But this slide indicates, I think, the progression from a very early age of young people from antisocial behaviours into drug misuse careers. So the question is, can we do anything about this at an early age with appropriately focused and targeted developmental prevention? This is a developmental prevention programme. It's called the Good Behaviour Game. This graph I've borrowed from a US National Institute for Drug Abuse report, which shows the outcomes of the Good Behaviour Game over a 14 to 15 year follow-up period. The Good Behaviour Game is a classroom behaviour management programme which is introduced in primary schools when children are aged 6 or 7, and it encourages pro-social behaviours in young people, especially those young people who are more at risk because they have more antisocial behaviour tendencies. In this trial, the Good Behaviour Game was used for 2 years at the ages of 6 or 7, and then the young people were followed up for 14 or 15 years and compared with a control group in a randomized controlled trial. So it was a good, high-quality scientific design. We can see in this slide impacts of the Good Behaviour Game on smoking and drug abuse diagnosis 15 years after the intervention. So for drug abuse and smoking, there are not many benefits on the face of it for females. The effect sizes are quite small there, probably not statistically significant. On the other hand, for males, for all males, then you've got, for drug abuse, a 10 to 11% reduction in prevalence at age 21. And these are medical diagnoses of drug abuse. For smoking, you've got a reduction as well, and these are significant. What is interesting here, of course, is that for those males who are more at risk, those 10 to 11% of young people at the age of 6 or 7 who had the most severe antisocial behaviour tendencies and were more at risk, by the age of 20 and 21, the impact on these young people is quite profound. So for drug abuse, if they weren't exposed to the Good Behaviour Game, then their risk of being drug abusers was towards 70%. If they were exposed to the Good Behaviour Game, then that prevalence had been reduced to just under 30%. And there were similarly impressive gains for smoking. So this is, I think, is a very clear and good example of how developmental preventions which target risk factors in early childhood can have a significant impact later on risk behaviours and health problems. The other benefit of these sorts of developmental prevention programs is that they're typically not focused on drugs or focused on substances. They're focused on relationships. They're about developing pro-social skills, about developing particular competencies, as Dr. Burkhardt mentioned earlier, from a very early age. And the development of these competencies impacts strongly on the developmental trajectory of these young people. So when we don't just see impacts on drug abuse or smoking, as illustrated in this slide, there are also significant impacts on mental health problems, on alcohol problems, and on risky sexual behaviour, for example, from this particular intervention, the good behaviour game. Okay, so that was an example of developmental prevention. Let's just consider briefly what we know about informational prevention approaches. This is a summary of, I think, what is the state of the art in terms of the evidence. An earlier WHO review concluded that the use of mass media alone was not an effective way to prevent or reduce drug use. A large evaluation, scientific research study of a US anti-drug media campaign showed no impact on marijuana use. Marijuana use was the focus of the campaign. And potentially some iatrogenic effects, and by that I mean that people who were exposed to the program, there was an indication that they may be more likely to become users. A very recent Cochrane review for mass media to prevent illicit drug use in young people, 23 studies and 188,000 participants, is fairly inconclusive. It says, as many of these studies do, more research is needed. But I think more importantly, there was no clear effect. And if you're interested in that particular review, I know there is a presentation later on at this meeting about that particular evidence. And we've been working very recently on a Cochrane review of social normative approaches, a significant number of trials, 66 trials, 43,000 individuals, and we've concluded that there can be statistically significant effects, and at first glance you might think, great statistical effects, but when you look at the actual effect sizes, they're very small. And the outcome measures that these effect sizes are located on are not that useful or important. So our conclusion is, in fact, that these sorts of social normative interventions are, in fact, of little practical value on their own. Now, that's not to say that I think we shouldn't be doing informational approaches. That's not my job. I'm a scientist, I'm not a policymaker. The research evidence shows that these sorts of approaches are probably not going to have an impact on drug abuse. But societies might take a different perspective and say, well, actually, we value individuals, young people, being informed, even if it doesn't change their behaviour. I think that's a valid perspective, and that's up for debate and up for societies to decide themselves. It's not my job to make recommendations about particular policy options, but to just provide an overview of the evidence. So to conclude, I do think that we should consider both the form and function of prevention efforts in policy and planning. There is good and growing evidence for the ineffectiveness of informational approaches to impact on drug abuse, as well as a range of other risk behaviours. The evidence base for environmental approaches is pretty sparse. The conclusions so far are that legislation enforcement is limited in its capacity to prevent drug use. But I just want to reiterate, we do need more research in this area. I think it's a rich seam to mine, and more research is needed. Developmental approaches can have a modest impact on a range of maladaptive behaviours, including drug abuse, though well evidenced but complex prevention interventions may not transfer well to other settings. These developmental programmes, although they may be manualised, are often complex social interventions requiring training of practitioners and fidelity of delivery, there is some evidence that it can be challenging to transfer results on effectiveness from one setting to another. So that's something that we need to think about in terms of the adaptation and delivery of these sorts of developmental interventions in new settings. And that sort of leads on to this sort of next conclusion: whether the modest impact observed in some studies is still worth the costs of school or family-based intervention prevention programs is a judgment each society must make for itself. But just to end, there in fact is some very recent work looking at the costs and benefits to society of, for example, developmental prevention programs. And if we look at the good behaviour game, some very clear, comprehensive work by policymakers in the US has costed the cost of delivery, contrasted that with the benefits gained from the good behaviour game, and found that for every $1 it costs society to implement this developmental intervention, society will gain around $33 in terms of reduced costs to the individual, to healthcare systems, to social systems, and increased economic factors and outcomes for that individual. Thank you very much.